Today, most importantly, for us in the church, is Epiphany Sunday. So perhaps we need to begin with a trivia question. What is Epiphany? A, B, C, D, or E? D? E. That is the correct answer. It is all of the above. There are multiple meanings. In fact, I had a joke I was going to say at the beginning, but then I realized that if you don't know what epiphany means, you wouldn't find it funny at all. I was going to say, I was waiting for an epiphany while I was preparing this sermon, but alas, I had none until I woke up today and realized it was Epiphany, which uses all those definitions. Epiphany Sunday is also the climax of our Advent Christmas theme about the stars, both literally and metaphorically. Literally, the star was a guiding light for the Magi on their journey toward Jesus. And metaphorically, Jesus was born to be the light of the world for all people. In New Testament times, that would have been said as for Jews and Gentiles. But in more modern terms, we could say it is meant for all people of all colors, indigenous people, immigrants and settlers, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, atheists, all people are included in this story. It's a universal kind of story, which is why it's the climax of the Christmas season. Now, we have been studying the stars during this Christmas and Advent season, so let's continue our quiz and our theme of stars. Where does the first star appear in the Christmas story in the Bible? If you look at Luke chapter 2, as well as Matthew chapter 2, where does the star first appear? Anybody know this one? A, B, C, D, or E? E again. Okay, you're getting my pattern here, but I'm going to fool you on the next one. E is the correct answer, none of the above. There was no star to guide the shepherds to the stable, even though many nativity scenes come with a star over the stable. But that's just there. It's not actually in any of the stories, and there may have been stars in the sky that night, but it also may have been cloudy. We don't know. And the story in the Bibles just don't say anything. And it does say the glory of the Lord shone around the shepherds, but that glory of the Lord may not necessarily have been stars. So a star actually does not make it. If you've been paying attention, you will have noticed that a star doesn't really make it into any of the stories until today, even though that's kind of been our theme throughout. It doesn't happen till today's story. So let's continue our trivia questions. What was the occupation of the first people to notice the star? Okay, you know it's not going to be E. And it's not F. Actually, it's a combination of C and D. First of all, wise men is just a bad translation. That's the King James Version has wise men, and I think it might be a way to kind of hide the fact of who they really were. They were probably really smart. That may be that they were wise in that way, but it's just not a really good translation at all. B is wrong because there was yet no such thing as science of astronomy at the time. So we can rule that one out. Now, most modern English translations today would have D, magi, as the proper translation. But we get all sorts of incorrect connotations when we think magi is short for magician, but the magi were not magicians. They were not illusionists who practiced sleight of hand, and they didn't cast spells or mix potions or do wizardry like magicians do. So in a sense, C is the correct answer. They were astrologers, people who read their fortunes in the stars, in a sense, in the pre-modern religious sense. They consulted the stars for guidance, not only in their journey, but for guidance in their lives. It says they came from the east, probably Persia or Babylon of what is today Afghanistan, Iraq, or Iran. They were not God-fearing Jews, that much we know. They could have been star-worshipping pagans, or the most common religion of that region at the time was Zoroastrianism. And so if they were religious, that was probably their religion. Now that may make us feel a little uncomfortable, and it should. They were outsiders who worshiped stars or who followed stars. So this star, I'm just going to leave you in that discomfort. The star guides the astrologers to the house, it says, not the stable. The house where Jesus and his parents lived in Bethlehem. So it may have been a year or two, scholars believe perhaps a couple of years after Jesus' birth. So appropriate to visiting royalty, they come bearing gifts. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, or in modern language we'd say gold, perfume, and anointing oil. This reminds me of another question, and this is pure trivia. It has no relevance to the story. How many magi were there? E? No, that's the wrong answer. D is correct, yes. We know there were plural magi, so there must have been two or more. But three, there just were three gifts. There could have been 100 of them, and they each brought those three gifts. And of course, 12 is just a nice number that people in the Bible like to use, and 7 is the perfect number. But the correct answer is at least 2. My guess is at least half a dozen, because of primarily for the reasons of protection. And again, if you do some research into ancient travel, they would have needed to travel in a significant sized group just for their own safety and protection. And so my best guess would be at least half a dozen to a dozen or so traveling together, primarily for protection on a dangerous and long journey that would have taken them probably weeks. Months is even more realistic. Now, as with any good story, I don't know if Gemma and Avery have ever heard these words before. Do you know what the protagonist of a story is? A protagonist is the main character, or the good main character. So the Magi were the protagonists, or the good guys in the story, but every story also has antagonists, or the bad guys whose main job in the story is to thwart or to stop the plot from unfolding the way it's supposed to unfold. So, the Magi are the protagonists in this story Who are the antagonists in this story? B is correct. King Herod. Herod was the ruler of Bethlehem, Judea, where Jesus was born. Now, a little bit about this kingdom that he ruled. It was a small and poor state at the time. It was occupied territory, the way it is today, by the powerful Roman Empire. Herod was basically just a puppet king. In other words, more powerful forces were kind of making him really not having a lot of power. And Herod was known as an evil and conniving tyrant, best known for his temper tantrums and his paranoid grip on the little power which he had. If you do a bit of research on Herod, he had already killed his wife, or one of his wives, his mother-in-law, 2 sons, and the entire Jewish Sanhedrin, just because they were threatening his power. What little power that he had as the puppet king of the larger empire. So, when he hears that a group of foreigners, the Magi, remember they're coming from a long ways away, are in his territory searching for a new king, how do you think he felt? What would he do? And you can read all about it in the rest of chapter 2 of Matthew, starting with verse 13. And thankfully, for a G-rated audience, we're leaving that part out. So, now that we know the facts of the story from Matthew chapter 2 and our research, let's do some imagining about the story, some wondering. What happened to the Magi when they returned home after their visit to worship Jesus, the toddler king? I wonder how this visit affected them. Perhaps ultimately the question is, how does this story affect us? That is a question that T.S. Eliot, in his poem, The Journey of the Magi, explores. I've always wanted to use this poem in a sermon, and I actually thought I had a sermon somewhere in my files, but I couldn't find it, so I had to prepare it all over again, which is why I didn't get my epiphany. And I actually, about 30 years ago, wrote another poem to match the Journey of the Magi that has the antagonist version of the story. Now, whenever you use poetry, it's a bit of a problem because this is, again, why it's good to be married to a kindergarten teacher who doesn't really do poetry. When she read my sermon, she said, I don't get it at all, so I had to redo my sermon. So let me give you a bit of a primer on poetry for those of you who are not poets. So this poem, at the beginning of the poem, it's in your bulletin, by the way. We're not going to do intensive poetry analysis here, just to spare you if you're not into this sort of thing. But Joel had to cram it in, and so you don't see the 4 stanzas. But at the beginning of the poem, Eliot imagines the long journey that the Magi had. Then in the middle, and actually that's the 3rd stanza, he has a number of wonderful symbols, some of which are obvious and some of which are less obvious, linking it to the Jesus story. Then in the last stanza takes place a number of years later where the Magi recall this experience that they had. And I actually think where he imagines how they were impacted by their encounter with Jesus. And I think this is actually a wonderful prequel to our next preaching series that's coming up in the next few months about encounters with Jesus. In a sense, here's an encounter with Jesus the toddler by the Magi. So, with that little introduction, let's listen to the poem, and you can do more poetry analysis at home, which is why I've had them put in the bulletin. The Journey in the Magi. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. Oh, there were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Instead, the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile and the towns unfriendly and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then, at dawn, we came to a temperate valley, wet, below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream, and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at the open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, and so we continued, and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon. Finding the place, it was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago, I remember. And I would do it again. But set down. This set down. This. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. Some years ago, a few decades ago actually, I was concurrently reading the story in Matthew 2 and T.S. Eliot's poem, and I had an epiphany that I should write a partner poem about Herod's response to the new king. And maybe I just wrote the poem and never had a sermon, I don't remember. But I did find the poem. And it was putting myself in the place of King Herod, just as T.S. Eliot had put himself in the first person in the hearts and minds of the Magi. The kill switch of King Herod. Before Christmas, my kingdom was under control. My life, although not angelic, was not out of the ordinary. I was established in the status quo. But then those foreigners, those magicians, astrologers who plan their lives by stars came by to see about a king other than yours truly. Who can run my life but me? Who would have the audacity? Kill switch this light that brings me face to face with who I really am and who I might become. It is frightening and unknown. Kill switch this breaking dawn that shatters the safety of my night into pieces lying on the floor, helpless. And now babies, beggars, Romans, farmers, all the riffraff running to it. Kill switch this blazing light that beckons me too bright with revealing glow and penetrating warmth and a child's voice. If I follow, I might never be the same again. I fear. Kill switch. I cannot sleep, though it's dark as a black hole. Relentlessly, these daggers of the dawn keep coming at me like screensaver stars. And you can tell this was written in 1997. And they're driving me insane. Kill switch. How did the Magi respond to the light of the star? How did Herod respond to the light of the star? And which one are we most like? Herod could not stand the light of Christ. He wanted to put it out by killing all the babies born during that time. He wanted to run his own little kingdom. He had very little power, as I said, but he wanted to keep what little he had. And so he was afraid of revealing who he really was, of the light revealing who he really was. He was, in a sense, afraid of the death of the old self, as we read in T.S. Eliot's poem about the death of the old self. And so he refused to be transformed. The Magi followed the star to where Jesus was. They set out on this journey without a lot of knowledge, but with a lot of openness and curiosity. T.S. Eliot imagines that the Magi were transformed by their encounter with the divine child under the star. They were no longer at ease in the old dispensation, is a line. Their new birth meant their death of their old selves, and so birth and death are the same thing. And when they returned home, they gained a new perspective. And they became frustrated with their neighbors who were still clutching their old gods. Perhaps the last line in Matthew chapter 2, verse 12, Matthew 2:12, where it says, they go home by another route. And this is perhaps symbolic not only of that specific journey, but also symbolic of how they were impacted by their encounter with Jesus. They choose another route home from the one they came. What about us? Now, it's pretty easy to find similarities between Herod and the tyrants of our own day, and it makes us feel pretty good to criticize them. However, I would like to be a little bit more personal today. Perhaps a little Herod resides in my own heart. The kingdom of my life is pretty small, but I'm also afraid of losing what little control I have. This is something we go to if you're in the same stage of life I am. And everybody is in a transition of some kind. Especially if you consider global changes, which we have no control over, and then physical or chronological changes that we have no control over. Then I'm a little bit like Herod. I'd like to keep control of at least a little bit. Staying the same is easier than transformation. Sometimes the journey of following Jesus might also be a hard and bitter agony. And we might be tempted instead to kill switch the revealing light of Christ. But I encourage us on this fourth day of this new year to rather follow the example of the Magi, whose curiosity and their persistent openness propelled them on their long journey of following the star toward Jesus. So this year, let's not be satisfied with the old status quo gods. Let's return home to ourselves by another route. Amen.